In this lesson, we're going to talk about set dressing our level. Alright, so we have our terrain painted, and what we want to do now is we want to start adding in our assets and dressing up our level. So set dressing is a term that is used in films and things like that. So it's basically creating the sets in which the camera is going to be. So for games, it's kind of like the level designer's job or the level artist's job. So what we'll do is we'll bring in our assets and we'll start to block those in, getting the kind of the look that we want, the overall look, and then we'll start painting in details and things like that at a later time. So let's go ahead and start bringing in those assets. First thing that we want to do is go ahead and go to our prefabs folder, because remember, we've already set up our collisions and our materials for these objects. And so let's go ahead and just start bringing those into our scene. And we want to start manipulating them and placing them around the level. So I'm going to use these large rocks as a way to create barriers throughout the level. And so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab our move tool, or you can hit W on the keyboard to activate that. And we're going to lift this rock up into the air. Okay, and let's hit F to frame in on that so we can start orbiting around and moving this object. And I'll start to rotate this, hitting E on the keyboard to rotate it around. And we'll position this in a way that it's sitting inside of that sand. Okay, and we'll bring this about. We might even make this a little bit lower and then start to put this kind of on the path itself to where the sand is kind of built up over the backside of it. Now also notice that I'm using the local coordinate space for this object, and what that does is it changes the gizmo, whether that's your move, rotate, or scale gizmo, to orient to the object itself. And so this is really helpful if I start to move an object and start rotating it. So let me just show you what that looks like. Let's bring in this mound object, and you can see here that we can start to rotate it to try and make it fit a little bit better onto this surface. And so I'm going to rotate that around, and then I want to move it down into it, kind of in this direction, in its local direction. So because I'm set to local, I can just grab that Y axis, and I can just push that straight down. Now if this was set to global, you'll see that I can't do that. It just goes straight up and down. So local, global. Okay, so you can see how helpful that can be. And this also works for your rotation and your scale tool as well. So it just orients the gizmo a little bit differently. So now I can rotate this around, maybe move it again, and I'm using W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. Now if you want to scale this up, hit R, and you can you can scale in one direction or all three. Normally we want to orient or scale, in all three directions. So we'll grab this box right here in the middle. Now on most objects, you don't want to change their scale, but with static objects like this, it's okay as long as you're staying within the range that the texture density can handle that. What do I mean by texture density? It's also referred to as texel density. If you start to stretch an object really large, notice how pixelated that texture gets, and that's texel density. And so you want to just be aware of whenever you're scaling your objects. And so we can see that we're starting to mix this in a little bit. Maybe I don't really want to bring that right up on top there. Let's try to make these assets sit right around the ground to where the player can see those. Okay. And up above, we're going to be able to see that from far away. But maybe we want something to look a little bit more like this, to where it looks like falling rock into this. Okay. Putting assets where the player can see those clearly is a little bit better than just kind of placing them in areas where they may not be able to see that. We could probably scatter that around a little bit if we wanted to, but we should be just fine with this. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's learn how to duplicate. We can continue to just drag and drop these into place right from our prefabs folder, and that's perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that. In fact, the advantage of doing that is that it recognizes the collisions of the surface, and you can drag and drop that very quickly and then orient that to wherever you need. So that's the advantage of using that. Now, if we wanted to duplicate it right here inside of the scene, we would just hit, let's see, is it Control D to duplicate? Yes, Control D to duplicate that. So you'll see that that is now duplicated, and we can go ahead and we can move that outside. And let's say that we want to rotate this around to maybe this direction, make it look a little bit different. It's okay if objects are colliding with one another. Okay, you don't have to worry about that looking really odd. In fact, rocks are a great asset to do this with. As you can see, you can't even tell that that's two rocks. Okay, so that's awesome. And then we can come in, let's duplicate this again, so Control D to duplicate that, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit differently, maybe at a different angle, and just kind of put that inside there a little bit more. Okay, and I'll start to kind of think about how the player is going to interact in these areas. Now, we don't want to create walls all over the place. Okay, that's just not going to look quite right. We do want to block the player from going into certain areas, but we do want to allow them to explore a little bit. So what about the boundaries? How do we deal with boundaries? Well, boundaries are a little difficult. We could go ahead and we could create a wall all the way around, and that might look a little funny, but that's usually the best kind of practice whenever you're creating things like this. Simply because what that does is that prevents that invisible wall problem. That breaks the immersion of your game. Even though this is going to be kind of a fun little game, running into an invisible wall can be kind of frustrating. You can't see that, and it breaks the player out of the game and can create some unintentional feelings in the gamer. Okay, and so we don't want to do that. So, you know, we don't want to make rocks all over the place in the middle, but around the outside, I think it's a little more acceptable. So let's start placing in some of them, like these medium rocks, just to kind of make this a little bit different. Okay, so I'll place that in here, and maybe this is kind of an obstacle that we can use to allow the player to get away from the enemy. So maybe they can run up this little side of the hill or something like that. Okay, always be aware of your collisions as well. You can see here that even with that collision, the player probably won't be able to get into that area. So if that's something that you want to have in the pathway, you need to make sure that you give them enough room in the collision itself. Okay, so that should be plenty of room. And again, if you want to check that scale, you could always bring in your character just to kind of see what that's going to look like. Okay, to help out with that. Now just remember that that is there, and to take that out whenever you are ready to set up your player character. So as you can see, that's manipulating game objects in the scene. That's kind of part of set dressing. And now this is where the fun part comes in. I want you to go in between lessons. So after this, I want you to take these objects and I want you to spread them out and make a map of your own. Have some fun with it. Just kind of learn about some of the techniques that I've just shown you and what we've just talked about. Spread more of these assets around. Kind of think about how the player is going to play the game and have some fun with it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue finishing this out in between lessons, and I'm actually going to create a prefab of the environment pieces all together. And then if you just want to get into this real quickly for the next lesson, you could just drop in the prefab next, and I'll show you how to do that in the next lesson.